The forest was ancient, a place where the trees had stood for centuries, their gnarled roots twisting into the earth like skeletal fingers. The sun barely pierced through the canopy of thick branches. Shadows ruled here, even in daylight. The kind of shadows that didn't belong. Chloe had heard the stories, of course. People from the nearby town whispered about those who entered the forest and never came back. They said the trees moved, that the ground was cursed, and that something waited in the dark. But those were just tales, right? Stories to keep children from wandering too far, to keep the curious from discovering what lay beyond. That's what Chloe told herself as she stood at the edge of the forest, staring into its depths. The air was still, too still. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't turn back now. Not after everything that had happened. Her brother, Marcus, had gone missing 3 days ago, and the police had found nothing. His friends, too, had disappeared. The only clue was his phone, discovered near the forest's edge, still recording. Just a brief, garbled message of terror before it cut off. "No," she whispered to herself. "I'm going in." With a deep breath, Chloe stepped into the forest. The air inside was cold, heavier than outside, and the silence was suffocating. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks thick and looming, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally. The path ahead was barely visible, the ground soft and wet beneath her boots. Chloe moved cautiously, her hand gripping the flashlight, its beam weak in the dense fog of twilight. The wind whispered through the leaves, but there was something off about it. A quiet hum, like a far-off voice, reverberated through the trees. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, but it wasn't just the wind. Something was watching her. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She spun, eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing, just the endless, oppressive silence. She pressed on, her breath growing shallow, her pulse quickening with every step. The forest felt alive. Every creaking branch, every rustle in the undergrowth felt like a whisper, like the very trees were waiting for something, waiting for her. Then, she saw it, a figure, barely visible through the thick fog, standing motionless between the trees. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head twisted toward her, too slowly, and a dark, hollow gaze locked onto her own. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stared, and Chloe froze. She couldn't tear her eyes away, as if something about its gaze held her captive. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet rumbled. The trees groaned, their branches twisting, as though alive, reaching toward her. The figure's head snapped forward, its body lurching into motion, moving with an unnatural speed, like a predator closing in on its prey. Chloe's survival instinct kicked in. She turned and bolted, her legs burning as she pushed herself through the thick underbrush, her flashlight shaking in her grip. She could hear it behind her now, footsteps, dragging and slow, but gaining on her with terrifying ease. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She couldn't let whatever that thing was catch her. The air was thick with dread, and the shadows pressed in from all sides, dark tendrils creeping toward her, as if the forest itself were alive, complicit in the hunt. Another rumble. The earth seemed to tremble beneath her. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell, her flashlight tumbling away. The world went dark for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest, but she forced herself to her feet. She couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. The wind picked up, now howling in her ears, and in its shriek, she thought she heard her name. Chloe. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but it cut through the forest like a knife. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she thought she saw Marcus, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror, standing in the mist ahead of her. "Marcus," she called out, her voice trembling. But the figure only stared, its face a blank void, its eyes too dark to see. It wasn't him. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet cracked and the trees around her shifted, moving as if they were alive. A horrible, grinding sound filled the air, and the ground split open, revealing a pit that seemed to go on forever. From the depths, a voice, deep and low, echoed up from the darkness. "Leave or die." The figure lunged forward with inhuman speed. Chloe screamed and sprinted in the opposite direction, her legs screaming with exhaustion. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees reaching down to snag at her clothing, the ground pulling at her feet. She could feel it now, its presence closer, more pressing. The air around her seemed to crackle with malignant energy. The forest wasn't just alive, it was feeding, and she was its prey. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, nearly falling into the yawning pit that had appeared behind her. There was no escape. The ground around her seemed to pulse, as though the earth itself had become part of the malevolent force that was hunting her. With a final scream, Chloe felt a cold, skeletal hand close around her ankle, dragging her toward the abyss. The last thing she heard was the whispering voice from the dark. "You were never meant to leave." The search parties came, but they found nothing. No sign of Chloe, no sign of her brother. The forest remained silent, its shadows as thick as ever, hiding whatever malevolent presence still lingered within its depths. And those who ventured too close swore they heard whispers on the wind, calling out names, pulling at their minds. The forest waited. It always waited,